Hi, thank you for joining me for my 5-minute Bible study today. We continue in the book of Colossians. Today we're in chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at verse 4. If you haven't already, go ahead and grab your Bibles. Take a look at verses 1 through 5 to get the context. And in fact, if it's possible, go ahead and look all the way back in chapter 1, verse 24, and read through to chapter 2, verse 5. I know there's a chapter break there, but it's a really bad chapter break. It shouldn't have been put there. And so go ahead and take a look at all of that, because that'll give you the true context of what Paul's talking about, which is going to be important for us today, because today Paul is going to point out something new, and he's going to point back to what he's been talking about. So I want us to see that by looking at that full context. So let's see what it says in verse 4. Chapter 2, verse 4 says, I say this so that no one will delude you with persuasive argument. So two things. Number one, here for the first time we hear Paul talking about being deceived or deluded. We've been saying since the beginning of the study that the reason that Paul wrote this letter is to fight against the false teachers that were trying to deceive and delude the Colossians. So for the first time, Paul actually mentions it here. So for the whole first chapter and the part of the second chapter that we've already read, Paul didn't mention the false teachers, but he's been setting up his argument. And so here, for the first time, he points out the purpose of this letter is to fight against these false teachers. And so he wants to make sure that they're not deluded. He says, I say this. And there's some confusion there. Some people think that that means I say this as in what I'm about to say, moving forward in chapter 2. But most scholars actually agree with what I believe. He's talking about what he's already said. I said all these things, the whole argument I've been laying out about myself, who I am, what I'm doing, this whole argument that he's been laying about who Jesus is, what Jesus has done. This whole thing, everything that I've spoken about up to this point, I say this so that no one will delude you. Now, what is that word delude? It's also deceive. It's that same word, deceive, delude. And when we think about being deceived, there's a couple of ways that we can be deceived. The most obvious is the way we think of the great deceiver, Satan, who lies to us. He's the liar. He's the father of all lies. And so we can be deceived through lies. Somebody just tells us a complete lie, a complete untruth, and we hear that and we are deceived. We believed it when we probably shouldn't have. I think a real life example of that is politicians today. I don't know if there's a politician that doesn't go on the campaign trail, promises one thing, and then does something else when they get in, right? So they all do it. Doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat. That's just politics in America. And so that's deceiving through lying. You're saying, you're making a promise, you're saying you're going to do this one thing, and you had no intention of doing it. But you needed to say that to deceive so you can get what you needed, what you wanted. That's one type of deception. But Paul's actually not talking about that type of deception. That's not what the false teachers are doing. They're doing something a little bit different. And he calls it here persuasive argument. So what does he mean by persuasive argument? Well, persuasive argument is the idea that I'm going to use logic to try to show you my thinking so that you believe me, even if I'm wrong. And we see that a lot. We see that. In fact, I always say, I believe in science. I think science is an important thing. In fact, Christians are some of the greatest scientists that have ever existed. You think about Newton, you think about Pascal, you think of Galileo. The list goes on of the great Christians who were great scientists. And so I believe in science. I don't think that there's a dichotomy between science and faith. But what I do think is that in these days, a lot of science has been politicized. And so what happens is we make the science mean what we want it to mean. We throw out bad data, we keep good data, and we make science mean what we want it to mean. That's deceptive, right? Now, we're not lying. We're showing you the evidence of the surveys and the experiments we did, but we're kind of hiding some things so you don't see the whole thing. I'm going to argue with human wisdom, and when I do that, there's always problems with human wisdom. Human wisdom is never complete, it's never true, fully. So we need to be careful when somebody comes to us with human wisdom, and because it's easy for us to get deceived. Christians have been deceived by human wisdom. Churches have been deceived. Pastors have been deceived. Denominations are being deceived today because of human wisdom. So you have to be really careful with that. And Paul's writing here because he does not want us to be deceived or deluded with persuasive argument, human wisdom. So with that, we thank you for being with me today. I appreciate it. We kind of get through this portion that Paul wants us to know about being deceived. We're going to continue on with verse 5 tomorrow, which finishes this little section here. So join me again. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And until we get back together again tomorrow, thank you for being with me, and God bless you.